Everyone, so welcome back to another game review. Today I'll be looking over the round 11 game between Fabiano Caruana and Liren. Um, so let's just jump into it. So Fabi is playing white, Ding is playing black, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we get a Spanish position like this, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, very standard stuff. B5, bishop e3. This is all actually very mainline Italian theory, or not Italian, I'm sorry, Spanish theory. So castles, and here white plays the move a4. Now, if white were to go with a normal plan like c3, this allows black to go into a very well-known Marshall Gambit with d5. So I'll just give you an example of the main line. After e takes, knight takes pawn. Black gambits a pawn, but in return he gets very powerful pieces. So you can see how these bishops are very active after bishop d6. The knight is well placed, and the queen will hop out to h4. And this is known to be actually a very dangerous variation for white to play. Dangerous for white. So that is why people nowadays don't really play c3, because it would allow d5. Instead, they play anti-marshals. So a4 is one of the main anti-marshals. The idea is, for example, if black were to try to go with d5 again, then this is not working because you can just take this and you get a position like this. Of course, just going back here, this pawn cannot be taken because the rook hangs. So after these exchanges, white is just much better here. This e-pawn is weak. White will have very easy development. This is a semi-open file. The c-pawn is very strong. And white is just up a pawn, basically, for nothing. So that is why instead of playing d5, they go with a very normal bishop e7, d3, d6, and now bishop d2, and this was tried before. The idea is that, well, in other lines, for example, in the main line here, let's say knight bd2 is played, knight a5 is an annoying move, and after bishop a2, c5, and black gains a lot of space here. And actually, this a-pawn looks a little bit odd. It would probably have to exchange itself. Or sometimes black just even pushes and ignores the pawn. And this bishop is kind of like blocking the rook. So I think as a way to avoid this temporarily, they play bishop d2 just to prevent knight a5 and this rapid expansion with c5. So queen d7 makes sense to just connect the rooks, develop the queen to a square. Notice how this queen might enter the light squares because the bishop is on this diagonal. So knight c3. Now knight a5, and the moment this bishop was blocked, knight a5 is played. The bishop goes back, and now b4. Now c5 was tried here, and there have been many games with this, and white just goes knight e2, knight g3, and the game continues. This is actually played between Becquerel and Carlsen in 2021, recently. So, but instead of that, bishop a2, b4, and now knight e2. White is just going to put his knight on g3, try to gun for f5, and maybe start some sort of kingside attack. Black, on the other hand, will probably try to play on the queen side with moves like c5, c4. If given the chance, break with d5 at some moment, bring the rooks to the b8 square, the c8 square, and black might even try to get b3 in. We'll see how the game goes. So c5, black continues with his plan. And now knight g3. And rook a b8, just putting the rook, first of all, giving the bishop room if it ever needs to retreat, and also supporting the b-pawn indirectly. For the moment, the b-pawn cannot move because the bishop will just take the knight, but there's always this idea looming that, maybe c4 will come, maybe b3 will come. And now knight h4. I do want to very quickly note, black cannot take this pawn. This will blunder immediately into bishop takes f7, and you lose your queen. So that's not working. So knight h4, and this is actually a new move. Prior to this, there have been like 3 games played between some pretty strong masters, and the games usually went with knight f5. One of them went with c3. So in this position, Caruana decided to just go knight h4 and try to land the knights on f5. This was stopped with g6. Bishop h6 kicks the rook. The rook moves to e8. This is because it will cover the e-pawn. It doesn't really need to move to any other square like c8 or d8. It's fine on e8. And the bishop might come back to f8 to exchange this one off. And now knight hf5, this really interesting move. Okay, yeah, you cannot take this. If you take this, you're going to get destroyed. After knight takes f5, it looks like white is down material, which he is, but he gets a very strong kingside initiative going. So for example, king h8, let's say, to avoid any sort of checks, bishop g7, and you can just bring the queen in, and very slowly moves like knight h6 will become real, queen g4 will become real, queen h6 will become a problem. So it's just a very like uncomfortable position. Rook e3, rook g3 is the main threat as well. So this is really not a good, it's not a good idea to take this knight. You're going to get destroyed. So bishop d8. Now if bishop f8 to exchange the pieces, now bishop g5. And this is again very annoying. You really cannot take this knight because you will just get checkmated. So, you know, you would have to somehow defend this knight. If something like this, then you could just take this, and that's a goner. And if, for example, again this, then you could just take this. And after queen takes, for example, rook e3 is a strong move, preparing rook f3, and there's really no good way to avoid this because h6 will not kick the bishop. This will just be taken. And black is just losing here. So this is kind of the danger that looms in this position. So bishop d8 was played instead. A very natural bishop f8 loses. So knight g7, and this looks really scary for black because it looks like white's pieces are just invading and black has to sit tight and just hope for the best. Which is really all that, black has to sit back and hope for the best. But, I mean, that's all black can really do at the moment. So rook f8. And now h3. There is another move here, which is just to move the knight back, and rook e8 would be a repetition of moves. But I think instead, Caruana was also playing this very quickly. So I think this was actually all prep. After h3, I think that he was finally out of his prep. So on move 19, I think he finally started having to think for himself. That's just my theory. I'm not actually sure if this was all prepared. h3 just stopping knight g4, so the bishop will remain on h6. So b3 was played by Ding, and this is just to basically block out this bishop. And here Caruana had a 17-minute think, and it's just a decision between capturing with the bishop or retreating it. And Caruana decided to take this pawn with the bishop and give up his bishop. Now, why not pawn takes? Well, if, for example, something like knight c6, the knight will reroute to either this square or this square. And this knight is actually not doing anything. This bishop is not doing anything. Any discovery here would just lead to exchanges where white will have to give up two pieces, his knight and his bishop, for one rook. So that's not really good. If white continues casually with something like rook c1, let's say bishop e7, just to connect the rooks. And now this is actually completely fine for black. Black is even much better here. Knight f5, for example, just to get the knight out of there. This is an interesting sacrifice here, but it doesn't really amount to much. If, of course, white doesn't do anything else, then this knight is just kind of stranded here. In a way, white trapped his own knight. So this is not good because you can see how this bishop is just completely dead. So if we follow the variation along, in this sort of position, yes, black can give up the exchange. It's not even really an exchange because his bishop is just dead. So, and black is just much better here, if not like winning, because this bishop is dead and it has no way to enter the game. Something like this still doesn't let it enter the game. He would have to play something like b4, but that would leave a weakness on a4. So that is why Caruana decided to just take with the bishop to get rid of this bishop, because if he kept it, it would just become a problem piece. And I think he'd rather remove this knight from rerouting to c6 and then d4 or b4. So Ding obliged and took the bishop. And now white has this double pawn structure, but it doesn't really matter because black can't immediately attack this pawn structure. But we'll see what happens. So bishop c6, basically opening up the eye of the rook to look at b3. Rook c1. And king h8. Now, this obviously can't be taken, but the point of rook c1 is at some point, you know, this rook has to get into the game. So maybe rook c2 is the idea, maybe rook c4, maybe rook c3. Just a good square for the rook. So king h8, just, I think the idea of king h8 was just to maybe even give white a move, because black can't really improve too much here. Here, Caruana takes the chance to play knight e6. Which wins the exchange, well, sort of, temporarily. And after bishop h6, black wins his back. Notice how after bishop a5, there's a discovered attack on the bishop. It is not advisable to do this, because queen takes, and actually this is very strong. The rook is hit. You know, if something like rook e2, then bishop d7 comes into the game. Bishop e6 is the idea. So, and b3 would be very hard to hold. This bishop is beautiful. The light squared bishop will also be very well placed. So that is why you have to play bishop h6 and give the exchange back. And here we go into the next phase of the game. So Ding took the pawn on b3, and now queen a5. Here Ding played a move that I guess looks a little bit strange, but it makes sense. So he played knight g8. Which looks a little bit odd. Now you might think that this is just to avoid queen d8, but actually it has a bigger purpose. So let's look at some variations here. If, for example, black were to take this pawn, it looks free. Let's say white takes on a6. Now the problem is white has this annoying passed a pawn, and I think Ding didn't really want to give white the chance to even try to push this. If black tries to go for it with something like queen d7, white can just continue with knight f1, rerouting the knight. The knight was doing nothing because on g3 it was only looking at f5 and h5, so knight f1 makes sense. And let's say, for example, bishop takes a4. It looks logical to just get rid of that pawn, but actually this doesn't work because if rook takes c5. And suddenly, this is a disaster, because now white has rook c8 coming with queen a8. This cannot be taken. You get mated instantly. So that is the little trick here, is that this pawn is actually a poison pawn. You cannot take this. If black were to try to get it in another way, let's say rook b4, then rook c4, and this is just holding everything together. Rook c1, rook c1. You could just repeat moves here. And black has no way to make progress. So I think that is why you cannot take on b2. Queen d8 is not really a threat, and I'll show you why. So if something like queen d8 here, then just knight e8, and black is completely fine in this case. He will evacuate the king with g8, king f7, and hold everything together. White runs out of any initiative on the king side. So queen d8 was not the threat. It's actually the problem with this knight. In the long term, this knight is actually poorly placed. So that's why knight g8 is played. Because now if there's ever any tricks with, like, there's no rook c5 trick, the knight will never hang. And the knight can also reroute into the game like this. The knight on f6 is actually not doing much. It also has every square is almost covered. It would have to go back to d7, but then where is it going from there? b6? It looks a little weird. So knight g8 makes a lot of sense. And now bishop e3. And again, there's some idea here. So for example, if rook takes b2, again, this pawn looks free. Queen takes a6, and let's say queen d7. Again, this idea to just try to pick up the pawn. White doesn't have to move it. He could just play d4. This is a very strong move. Of course, the idea is that if this is taken, then you can actually take. You don't even have to take the bishop first because the rook is hanging. So you could take, and then you can take this. And this is actually a very annoying endgame you could even do better. You could probably play like rook takes here and just keep the pieces on the board. This check has nothing to do. Can do nothing to white. So this is why I think that he didn't take the b pawn. It was just it's poisonous, because after this pawn falls, white has this invulnerable a pawn. So instead, bishop b7 was played just to step out of the line of the rook. cover a6. But in return, what this does do is it actually cuts off the rook from the 7th rank, and we'll see what that does in a minute. So queen d2 was played. This covers the b pawn, but also prepares some sort of idea with f4. So f6 was played. This was just to give the king some room if he needs to escape. But I think it also had something. He also had another idea in mind. I do want to show you what happens if, for example, black plays something else, like knight e7, let's say. This looks logical. But now white gets an f4, and if this is taken, and let's say knight c6, bishop g5 is actually really annoying. And this threatens a lot of issues on the dark squares. So for example, knight e5. Let's say black continues. Now rook f1, and again, bishop f6 looks very annoying. Knight d7 covers it for the moment, but now knight e2. And maybe knight f4 is coming, maybe d4 is coming, maybe the knight will come in and come to c3. Just not a very pleasant position for black to play. The dark squares are just way too weak. And white can even try moves like queen c2 and maybe try to kick the rook at some point after the queen moves. I think that the actual threat is queen c2 here. So basically f6 was played, and after f4, Ding took this, and then he played this move g5, which I don't really like this move. I don't really know a better suggestion. I'm guessing something like d5 might have been more interesting to play, because if this is taken, then queen takes, and actually you might have some sort of pressure here. But that wasn't played, and it's a little risky. But g5 just looks very weakening, because you're basically opening up your king a bit more. The dark squares are already weak, so white can try to utilize these weak dark squares here. So bishop e3, and now queen e5, and I think he was just trying to cover all these squares here, and basically look at the knight. So knight f5 was played. Now knight e7. Black desperately needs to exchange off this knight on f5. Now here, if instead of knight e7, if black were to do something like this, which is very careless, you would run into issues because d6 falls. The same thing happens with the rook. If rook takes b2 and knight d6 is very strong because the queen cannot take, this drops. And if, for example, rook takes d2, knight f7 just wins because it's a check. Basically, black is going to lose material here. After knight d7, this pawn is falling. There's no way to stop this. So that is not really ideal. So you can't do that. I also want to show another move a little bit further back. So back here, when f4 was played, we saw that after g5, this sort of weakens the king. There is a more interesting move here. Instead of taking here, you could play rook b4, just avoiding the tricks with queen c2, defending the rook. But the other point is that if white were to try to advance with f5, now you go queen a2, and actually the combination with the rook and queen are very strong. And taking on g6 does nothing, because the king is actually perfectly safe. The pawns are good cover, and so is the knight. But this is a computer variation. It's actually pretty hard to see why rook b4 works. But anyways, let's go back to the position we were talking about here. So queen c2. Black managed to exchange off the knight on f5, and now queen c2. And I think the risk that white has here is white is better, obviously. But the more pieces you exchange, the more you liquefy the position. So when you exchange more and more pieces, you're going to run out of attacking potential. And I think that's what happens with white here, is that slowly but surely Ding makes it so that white runs out of any attacking possibilities because there's so many pieces off the board. So rook f1 was played, and the idea is pretty simple. It's just going to target f6. This is a very serious weakness here. And now king g7. I do want to show you what happens if something like h6 is played, which is, again, a very careless move. But I just want to show the examples of what kind of danger exists here. So let's say a5, kicking the rook first. Rook c6. Now bishop d2, and the idea is very simple. Bishop c3. And this bishop will be very annoying. If black tries to rush to defend it, you can actually just take this because of bishop c3, and this just wins the queen. Very dangerous position to play. So black is not in time to defend this pawn. So that is why in this position, king g7 is played. Because if bishop d2 now, this is a little bit different. Because now bishop c3 isn't as serious of a threat. you can play the move d5 here, which is very strong. So for example, if bishop c3, obviously you could just close things down with d4. And black is fine. Black has finally managed to close down this long diagonal, and white has lost his attacking potential. So that is why king g7 was played. So a5 hits the rook. Now rook c6. And again, if actually bishop d2 was played here, but now the rook makes it in time. Rook c8. And this tactic doesn't actually work here, because there's king takes, not queen takes. So the tactic is not working. Rook c8 is actually there in time to cover the pawn with rook f8. So bishop c3 hits the pawn, rook f8 defends the pawn, makes sense. Now queen f2 hits the pawn again. But actually there is no real threat here. Everything is defended. 3 pieces covered, 3 pieces attack it. So it's fine. Now h6, and Ding plays this just very carefully, just defending this pawn. And Caruana, I think, here makes a pretty rash decision. He plays h4 instantly. He could have tried something else, but I'm not really sure what else to suggest for white. Maybe b4. I mean, this was played in the game anyways. b4 was played anyways, but maybe he could hold off on h4. But the idea here is actually very aggressive. So let's see. So bishop c8 was played. I'll explain why that was played. And I just want to show you the kind of threats that exist here. If black is once again careless and plays a dumb move like bishop a8, which does absolutely nothing, now queen f5 is a problem. The problem here is that after takes, queen takes is possible because the bishop pins the king. So if something like queen f7, for example, you can just take this and then take, and this pin is very annoying, and you lose as black. So that's not working. If instead of queen f7, let's say black tries to step out of this pin, well, it doesn't work anyways because now f6 falls. So you can see how like this is actually very dangerous. So Ding defends correctly. He just plays bishop c8 to cover the f5 square. And now b4, and Caruana tries to open up the other side of the board. Notice how good players, they play on all sides of the board. The queen side and the king side. Caruana's doing a great job here. I mean, so far he's actually doing pretty well. For the amount of pieces he has, he's actually still creating chances for himself. The threat here is very simple. Bishop d7 was played. But if, for example, this was taken, well, this is going to be a disaster because d6 is weak. Queen b6 is coming. Maybe rook c1, maybe rook c7. This just opens up way too many lines for black. So he can't really do this. Taking the pawn is suicidal. So bishop d7, and now this was taken. And this creates another weakness. There's another weakness in the position. There are 2 weaknesses now, f6 and c5. But I like the way that Ding holds this all together. He's actually very, I should say, prudent in defending. He actually created very good chances for himself to hold this position. So he played bishop, after rook b1, he played bishop b5. Just to block the rook from coming to b7. This is a good move. The bishop is actually serving a great purpose here. It wasn't doing anything to protect f6. And black here is almost out of moves. I mean, he can't really move a lot of these pieces because he needs to hold f6, and the bishop cannot move because rook b7 shouldn't be allowed at any cost. Not at this point, but there might be eventual threats to play the rook down into b6 or b7 or even b8. Not right now, but in the future. So bishop b5 just blocks all that out. H takes g5, and now h takes g5. And I think this was, again, another rash decision by Caruana. I think he should have just switched the rook to either to e1, d1, maybe even back to f1. I think rook e1 is good, because now you're threatening e5 in some cases, and they can get very tricky. Like queen g3, e5 is a very strong idea. Like let's say king g8, queen g3, and now e5 is actually quite an annoying threat at some points. You can take on g5 first, of course. But that's another way to play for white. He doesn't have to rush things. Just defend this pawn and just try to make threats. Instead, Caruana took on g5 first, which looks like it just opens up the h-file that white can maybe use. But white is just too slow in actually doing anything here. He can't really transfer his pieces to the h-file because h4 is covered. He can't play rook h1. Moving around your king too much will lead to checks with either rook h8 or maybe queen d6. It just gets annoying. And actually, we'll see in the game how this open h-file is actually a bother to white and not black. So queen f5, again, he's just trying to threaten this queen takes g5. So king g8 just stepping out of the way, and we notice how the rook kind of wants to be on f1 because then f6 would fall. Now, just to note, queen g6 check leads to nothing because of queen g7, and we can just go right back. And basically, if you exchange queens, you're going into an equal endgame. So that's not working. So here, Caruana played d4, just trying to break things apart. However, this does allow bishop d3, which hits the e-pawn, hits the rook, so the rook has to move. Note how the rook cannot really stay on this b-file anymore. The pawn will fall, so he has to play rook e1. And now c takes d4, bishop takes, and again, more pawns are exchanged. The more pawns that are exchanged and the more pieces that are exchanged, the more white loses his potential for attack. And I think Ding has done an excellent job finding really good resources to just take away white's advantage. Queen h7, good move, offering a queen exchange. If this is taken, of course, you're just going to end up in a very equal endgame. There's nothing to do here. e5 is not that scary. You can just take this, and after something like this, you can see how this is a complete draw. Actually, I would even prefer black because he has the b5 square. And you know, maybe shots at f1. So this is not working, so you can't take that queen. So queen f3, white goes back. And now bishop b5, very calm move, just planting the bishop back on b5. The ideas are also bishop c6. And you'll see how this idea with bishop c6 becomes an actual issue. I just want to go back a move. So if instead you also try to do queen e6 check, king g7 is not working, because after rook e3, this is becoming a problem. The h-file is actually accessible. There's no way to save the bishop and prevent rook h3. So that's not working. But instead of king g7, just a very calm queen f7, again offering a queen exchange. And white has nothing better to do than just to go back here. Queen b6 is really not doing anything either. Black is absolutely fine here. So queen f3. Bishop b5, avoiding getting captured, but just, parking the bishop here. And trying to bring the bishop to c6 at some point. You'll see the idea in the game. So e5 was played. Again, white is trying to open up more lines, but in doing so, he's risking more for himself. This king is actually not as safe as it looks. It only has one pawn covering it, and this h-file is open. This bishop is actually covering a lot of vital squares. So white does have to be a little bit careful here. Queen d7 was played. This is a good move. Hitting the bishop, covering e6 for a bit. Looking at these light squares, really good move. Bishop c5 hits the rook. Rook c8 hits the bishop again. Now, queen b3 was played, and maybe bishop f2 should have been played instead. Now, after this, of course, we get into an endgame like this, where white has to exchange queens. There's no other alternative. If you play king g3 here, I think queen h4 is just mate. So that's not working. So he has to exchange queens, and when you go into this endgame, it's just a draw. And I think Caruana at this point in the tournament really didn't want to bother trying to grind out an equal endgame, especially in this case, like Ding would never lose. So instead he played here queen b3, and at first glance this looks really strong, because you're allowing e6. Black should not be playing here king g7, because now after e takes f6, rook e7 just wins the game, because there's no way to stop queen f7, and you have to give up your queen just to survive here as black. So obviously not king g7, but again, just offering this queen exchange. And I think Ding calculated this really, really well, because after e6 it looks scary, like you're allowing a discover check and e7 is protected. It looks very scary for black, but after a very calm queen c7, this is absolutely fine. e7 check does nothing. King g7, the pawn cannot promote. This bishop is a beautiful piece. It's covering the queening square with this rook. And actually now it's white's turn to deal with his problems. These pawns have suddenly become stronger because there are no pawn breaks to break down these pawns. So in any endgame, this would be a 2-on-1. If you got rid of this pawn, of course. But it would be a 2-on-1 in any endgame. This bishop is beautifully placed. And white has to now answer the question of his own bishop. So he plays here bishop d4. And the idea is to just, again, try to target this f6 pawn somehow. Maybe play rook e6. It's really hard. But you have to also, as a white, you have to always check out, like, queen at c1 check if the rook moves. You also have to look out for stuff like rook h8 and then queen h2. It's a very tough position to hold as white. To actually like fight with this as white is hard, because again the queening square is protected very well. There's no way to dislodge this light squared bishop. So queen f4 was played, just hitting the bishop again, and also preventing queen f3. If something like this, this is not working because rook c1. Like this is the kind of thrust that exists here. White's king is getting mated, so you can't really easily attack this f pawn. Again, queen f3 would just lead to an endgame. I even think queen f3 is actually a better endgame. Oh, just drops the bishop. Whoops. That's how you know that I haven't gotten enough sleep. But yeah, so bishop e3 was played here, and the computer suggests that queen e3 is being played. It should be played here, just to exchange the queens off, because black does have quite an initiative. I think the problem is rook h8, but also rook c1 if the rook moves. I mean, white's king is actually really exposed here. Everything is covered on f1. This bishop covers f1. The h-file is open for the rook. This rook cannot enter the h-file. So it's really annoying, and the computer suggests this kind of variation, but I think Caruana probably saw this and thought, okay, I don't want to play for a draw. I want to play for a win, so I'll play bishop e3. This is really not a good move. The other alternative is something like bishop b2, if he really didn't want to exchange queens. But I think he didn't play this because he saw rook h8, and now this is really looking suspicious, because the bishop is not in any position to defend the white king. It's not on d4. It's not on d4 or e3 or f2, so it's kind of overlooking this diagonal when it really should be looking at the king's diagonal. And the queen is hovering around, the rook is hovering around, just very unclear. And again, the computer suggests just quickly exchange queens before you get killed. And if you go into something like this, you have to exchange queens with queen g3. King f3 is a really risky way to play, because you're allowing g4. And, you know, white's king is just in the middle of the board. Really insane variation. White has to be very careful just to not allow his king to get attacked or some sort of skewered trick here. So instead, going back to this position, instead of bishop b2 or queen e3, he played bishop e3. And this steps off the diagonal of the king covering f6. So queen f3 is no longer a threat. It also blocks the pawn for the moment. Queen g3 was played, and this is a very good move. Just pinning this bishop. This bishop can no longer move, and it's hitting the rook as well. And this puts white into a very uncomfortable position. Again, like this light-scored bishop is such a beast. You can't play reasonable moves here. He had to play queen b4 here. I mean, queen d1 is also an answer. But after queen d1, you could, again, black would just play rook h8, and you know the attack will continue. Bishop c6 is an idea, and again this queening square is covered, and white's pieces have a very hard time defending because these light squares are all being controlled by this bishop. So just a very uncomfortable position to play. So queen b4 was played. Now rook h8 anyways. Black just continues his idea. He has no problem you know, just attacking white's king. Actually, it's the black king that is actually really secure, because these pawns are actually covering this king perfectly. This bishop is the wrong color. If this was a light squared bishop, white might have a chance to do something, because at least he'd be able to dislodge the bishop on g5. This bishop is a dark squared bishop. Ooh, not bishop f4. Misclick. But it just goes to show that actually all these pawns are really good cover for the black king. And Fabi had to give up this pawn, but I just want to show you why. Let's try out some moves here. So let's say queen c3. Looks like a bad move, right? Now bishop c6. Really strong. You can't take this because this is going to get taken, and that's mate. So you can't do that. Not only that, bishop c6 is just threatening mate. So this is like very difficult to hold. Okay, let's find a better move. Let's not try queen c3. It's a really bad move. Let's try bishop d4. Now queen h2. Now if bishop c6 here, this is a little bit different, because now you go into this position and queen d4 is an answer, and you actually win the rook in the corner. So that is why, for example, after bishop d4, black would just play queen h2 first, defending the rook in the corner now. And after queen f4, rook h4, what a move. The threat is simple, queen h2. Rook f4, and this king is going to get cut to shreds. There's also no way to unpin. Like, actually no way to unpin. Something like rook d1 is completely losing. Queen h2, again, rook f4, and white's king is just getting cut to shreds. There's really nothing to do here. Again, these light squares are all covered. This rook is beautifully placed. This queen is very active. White's king is just getting destroyed here. Nothing to do but give up pieces. So bishop d4 is not working. Okay, fine. What about something like bishop c5? Also looks reasonable. But then bishop c6 again, and this bishop in combination with this queen and this rook are just too powerful for white to deal with. Really, really annoying. So that is why, as a distraction tactic, he had to give up this pawn just to prevent himself from getting mated here. And he had to distract the rook from h8 for a moment, because that would buy him enough time to play queen g4 here. If queen g4, well, queen g4 obviously can't be played immediately. But if, for example, he didn't check and he just took this first, now this is actually defendable, because in this endgame, this is actually fine. There's no real threat anymore. So he had to give him this check first, and then take, and that way bishop f2 is not a thing, and the queen is on h2 instead. Okay, so what does white do? White played here queen g4. Now I want to quickly note what would happen if something like bishop d2, which looks like it might go into an endgame that actually isn't that bad. But you have to realize that there are still threats on the king, and these two pawns are actually really annoying, and the only one who could possibly win here is black. Because black has very active pieces, his queen is extremely active, and the king is actually pretty well placed. He could hide on g6, these pawns can be pushed in any endgame. And white is just going to suffer here for a very long time. I mean, the game will go on. So instead of bishop d2 or anything like that, I mean, there's also other alternatives. For example, well, the other idea here, which we'll see later, is bishop takes g5, which is a very interesting variation, because it looks like you're just giving up a piece for no reason. But actually, this is a table-based draw. Something like queen e7, and basically white is going to pick up the g-pawn and try to check this king around. If something like king h6, queen f6, you could try to block, but now queen f8, and black is going to have a hard time escaping these checks. You can't even play king h5 because you get skewered. So you have to play king h7 and just accept that you're going to get checked. And there's nothing you can do about it. And white gets a perpetual here. Very interesting variation. But okay, what if this was taken first? Instead of taking on g5, what if this was taken? Well, now here's the trick, is bishop f6 is actually a complete draw. Don't trust the computer evaluation bar. If it's minus 0.9, it's a draw. And this is actually a table-based draw. And the point is that white's queen is going to defend black's king, and as long as the king stays on like the dark squares, and he's just careful with these checks with the bishop, he can block almost anything. And there's really no way through for black, although this is still a complicated endgame, and I'm sure Ding wouldn't mind playing on for a little bit. But yeah, that's a very interesting move here. Bishop takes g5 after this. Instead, queen g4 was played. And again, playing bishop takes g5 in a tournament like this is very hard to do. So queen g4 was played. Now queen e5. Again, just trying to get queen b2 in at some point. Just aligning up. I mean, this is not a very comfortable game to play. And something like bishop d2 here is not good, because you have queen c5. And, the king is again getting cut to shreds. This is just a great position for black to play. I mean, this king is just so exposed. These pieces are very poorly placed. Queen d5 is a great move, just attacking g2. And with good play, black should win this. So, again, trying things like bishop d2 are not going to work. Actually, this king needs all the protection he can get. The bishop is actually well placed on e3 because it's preventing any kind of checks. So queen d4. Now white wants to exchange queens. I think it's a little bit too late for that, though. Queen f5, king g1, and now king g6. This is a great move, avoiding anything with queen a7. And the pressure's still on, and black is perfectly placed. This queen is wonderfully placed. His bishop is beautifully placed. His rook is beautifully placed. Black has an amazing position here. Also, not to mention, black is just a pawn up. It's 3 against 2. So queen d2. Now bishop c6. Bishop f2. Queen g4. And now, of course, if this is exchanged, queen g2 is mate. So you can't do that. So queen check, and now just bishop e4, strong move. You can't take it, of course, because you just lose material. So queen g3, and black accepts the queen exchange and plays f5. And look at these pawns. Look at this bishop. Beautiful piece. This bishop is beautiful on e4. It's just such a dominating piece. I'd argue that this bishop is worth more than the rook. So bishop c7. I think he's just trying to avoid anything with rook d8 and just defend the pawn. Also avoid anything with f4 because that would be devastating. Bishop c7 makes sense. King h5, black just tries to bring the king into the game. King f2, king g4, and now rook c1. It's hard to really pick a good move here. Rook c1 is pretty good. You could also try g3. This is just trying to prevent any kind of incursion with f4. Also playable. Rook c1 is fine, just defending the bishop. Just to note very quickly, rook c8 is not really doing anything. This pin is not that annoying. If anything, white can just play this, and bishop e5 will come in. This might actually be a draw. So black does have to be a little bit careful, but I think black would be happy with a draw here. I mean, the way he came out of the opening. So rook e7, rook c3. Now, rook c3, I'm not sure what this does. Maybe this had some idea of just, playing g3 and securing it more. Maybe rook g3 was an idea. Rook d7 is a good move. Now, there is a really interesting move here that was played later anyways, but bishop d3 immediately. Just blocking this, and, rook e2 is coming. Rook e2, king g3, and so on. Maybe rook d2, king g3. And this king is very, very... very at risk of getting mated, let's put it that way. So this is a strong move, and of course if this is taken, then this is taken, and the rook will come down. These pawns are very strong. This pawn can't really be picked up, for example, like this. Now rook c2, and if the king, let's say, goes back, f4 is a very strong move, and black is just going to, you could try and take this, but it won't matter because king g3, and suddenly white is in a mate net. It's incredible. So that is why after rook c3, okay, he played rook d7. I think he was just trying to enter on d2. g3 now. Now bishop d3. Again, similar idea as last time, but, instead of just hanging his bishop, he defends it. Bishop b8, bishop b5. Again, the rook is trying to come into the game. Bishop c7. Now, playing rook here is not dangerous because of king e1. And actually, this rook is holding the g-pawn. Now the rook hits this. And if you try to chase after this pawn, it's not going to work because they have this move. So for example, if takes, you can actually... First of all, this is hanging. But if, let's say, black tried something else, let's say he tried f4. This wouldn't work either because this all gets exchanged. And, something like rook e5, or maybe even... playing bishop b6 just to bring the rook around. Still very hard to hold because that pawn will be running. But interesting. I think the idea is that king e1 should not be played here. So here, Ding played rook e7. And I don't know what Fabi was thinking when he was playing like bishop b8, bishop c7. Like he kept doing like this back and forth thing. Maybe he should have played king e1 instantly just to prevent the rook from coming down at all. And these checks won't really do anything. I mean, if you try something like rook d4, for example, to come and chase after this pawn, rook a3 is holding it pretty easily. Rook e4, again, these checks really don't accomplish much. And, you could try to hassle the bishop, but the bishop can just come to c7. And this is different because the king, although it's further from these pawns, it's actually okay because any kind of attempt to go forward will just fail. So for example, if the rook moves, let's just pick a square like this. And let's say something like, I don't know, rook c3. I'm not playing exactly accurately, but let's say f4 here. And I mean, this is really not going to work because the rook is covering this and the bishop is covering this. Let's say something like rook c2, f3. Now bishop b6, and you can cover f2. And it's actually really hard for black to make any progress here. The bishop is well placed, and so is the rook. So that is why after something like this, he played rook e7, which is a really accurate and very strong move, just cutting the king off. And now this king is in some serious trouble because rook e2 is coming, and basically after something like rook d2, bishop d3, this pawn will be indefensible at some point. F4 pawn will come and this rook will be out of the game. So very good move, rook e7, just cutting the king off. The king cannot escape this way, so he'll be stuck fighting these kingside pawns, and this rook is perfectly placed to meet the king on the second rank. So bishop d8 was played just to kick the rook. This doesn't really do anything. And then after rook d2 hitting the bishop e7, bishop d3, and here white resigned. Now I do want to go back for a moment. Instead of maybe bishop d8, let's say he tries rook c2, which looks like an attempt, right? But now bishop d3. Now the rook has to keep in touch with the bishop, and it has to somehow prevent rook e2. That's not possible. So let's say something like rook d2, basically trying to pick up the bishop. But now we get the similar situation where after this happens, and if the king goes up, g3 is taken. If the king goes to g1, now rook a2, and this pawn is going to be collected. And this is just a losing endgame. This pawn is so weak, and the rook can't give any checks because this pawn will just be taken. And it's actually really hard to even hold this. I mean, like, this will just be taken if you try to defend the a pawn, and this is a loss. Okay, what if something else? What if instead of after bishop d3, okay, what if we try rook c3? It's a little bit different. But now again, rook e2, and this is the idea. After king g1, you play rook d2, and this is a mating net. This is actually a mating net. It's just very difficult to even try and hold this. Rook c6, for example, let's just say. King f3, the king comes in. There's really no way to check this king because everything is covered, and these pieces are blocking out the rook. Let's say rook g6, just to try to pick up the pawn. Doesn't matter. Rook g2, and now this move, bishop e4, and let's just go all the way to mate. Let's say takes, king f2, and this king is getting mated. And that's mate. So just to show you this, that's exactly why he resigned. Because in this position, once the rook enters the second rank and then the bishop blocks, this king can easily march in. Rook g2 is threatened, bishop e4, and this king will get mated. If not mated, you're losing the g-pawn. These pawns will run. So a great game by Ding Liren. What a defense. Really, the whole time I was watching this, I thought Caruana might even convert this or win. At the least, I thought Caruana would come out with a draw. But what a game by Ding. Really defended this from the go. The opening was an anti-martial. And here, basically, Ding survived the initial onslaught with knight f5 and avoided all the deadly tricks. And then after this, he just slowly started liquidating White's pieces and all his play. There were a lot of tricks. He avoided them, calculated this correctly, and understood that, White has to basically prove that he's better here. And here, yes, although he made a weakness with f6 and then playing g5, he still managed to hold this basically perfectly. Caruana was not able to find a good way to finish Ding off. Ding just held this like an absolute beast. Just a perfect calculation. Held f6, held it all together. And really, even in this position, I thought, White should be much better, at the least come out with a draw. Rook b1, and, after bishop b5, it suddenly looked like things are not going White's way. I think, Caruana, I think he's having a tough end of the tournament. He's been losing a lot of games. But yeah, I mean, this is just like exhaustion, and I think it's just a lot of, work and a lot of late nights he probably spent analyzing things. So, but yeah, I mean, even taking here was probably not the best decision. because as we saw in the games, h-file actually became white's downfall. Queen f5 really didn't do anything. I mean, Ding's found some great defensive resources here. And once he liquefied all the pieces, I think Fabiano just pushed too hard. He probably thought that he has to play for a win here if he has any chance in this tournament. But I think he pressed it too hard, and he ended up making a mistake, and Ding just outcalculated him. Simple as that. Like Queen f4, I mean, very solid moves. Just posing problems to white, and suddenly black just turned his game around completely. White had no way to escape this attack, and it's honestly, like, from this position, like, even before this, it's honestly very hard to hold this as white because his king was so exposed, and the black pieces are just swarming all around it. This bishop is, once again, beautifully placed, played a really important role in the game. Yeah, and after all this, even after the queen exchange, this was just a very hard endgame to hold because these pawns are scary. This bishop has really good places to sit on b5 and also e4. And I think here Caruana probably just cracked because he had a long game and he missed this idea with rook e7, just cutting off the king and developing a mating net. So a very nice game by Ding. I'll update the standings tomorrow. But yeah, so really nice game. I'm going to see you guys in round 12. I kind of feel bad for Caruana. I think he came to this tournament, there's a lot of pressure on him to be one of the top leaders. But in the recent games, he's honestly been struggling, keeping it together. So yeah, I'll see you in round 12. Nepo is still in the lead. He actually beat Firouzja today. The reason I didn't go over that game is because a lot of players have been, looking over that game, and I just felt like we should give more attention to games that haven't been as covered. So thank you very much. Have a good evening, good night, good week, whatever. Take it easy. Bye.